In this episode, we build a mental model you can carry into every question so you stop feeling like you have to memorize endless details to succeed. The AAIR exam tends to reward structured thinking more than trivia because the scenarios often describe messy, real-world situations where several answers sound plausible. A mental model is a simple order of operations that helps you decide what kind of problem you are looking at before you pick a solution. The model we'll practice is a deliberate sequence. Start with governance, then move to program, then to lifecycle, and only then choose controls. That order prevents the most common mistake beginners make, which is jumping straight to a favorite control without checking whether the organization has the right decision rights, repeatable processes, and lifecycle discipline to make any control actually work. When you can run this sequence quickly in your head, you become harder to trick with distractors and much faster at picking the best answer. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good mental model starts with governance because governance is where decision authority and accountability live, and most risk failures are really authority failures disguised as technical problems. Governance is the layer where the organization decides what it is willing to accept and what it refuses to tolerate, especially when harms could be irreversible. It is also where roles are defined. So when something goes wrong, there is a clear owner who can act and a clear path to escalation when stakes are high. If a scenario includes confusion about who can approve a use case, who can pause a risky feature, or who can accept residual risk, that is a governance problem before it is a control problem. Beginners sometimes skip that and reach for monitoring or training, but without governance, those actions become inconsistent and easy to ignore. Exam questions often hide governance gaps inside ordinary language, like a team moving fast without oversight, a feature expanding into new use, or leadership being unaware of a high-impact system. When you see those signals, your mental model tells you to fix governance first. Once governance is considered, shift to program thinking, because program is how governance becomes real in daily work. A program is not a document, and it is not a meeting. It is the repeatable machinery that turns decisions into action. Program thinking asks whether there is an intake process, whether risk is tiered proportionally, whether control choices are standardized, and whether evidence is produced consistently so decisions are defensible. If governance says certain risks require extra scrutiny, the program must provide a predictable path that delivers that scrutiny without relying on improvisation. Exam scenarios often imply program weakness when you see inconsistent reviews, ad hoc approvals, or teams reinventing safety from scratch each time. Program weakness also shows up when teams treat compliance as a checkbox, because that usually means processes are too heavy, too vague, or too disconnected from real workflows. When you anchor your thinking in program, you stop choosing answers that sound like ideals and start choosing answers that describe operational mechanisms. After governance and program, lifecycle comes next because AI risk is not static, and most long-term failures are lifecycle failures. Lifecycle thinking means you consider what must happen before deployment, what must happen during use, and what must happen when the system changes over time. A system might look safe in a pilot and then become unsafe when its audience grows, when its data shifts, or when people begin to rely on it more heavily. Lifecycle thinking asks whether validation occurred before exposure, whether monitoring exists after exposure, and whether change events trigger reassessment rather than silent drift. If a scenario includes a model that performed well months ago but is now generating complaints, that is a lifecycle signal that monitoring and reassessment are weak. If a scenario describes a system launching with a promise to monitor later, that is a lifecycle failure because detection and response must exist from day one when stakes are meaningful. Many distractor answers offer one-time testing as if it solves ongoing risk, and lifecycle thinking helps you reject those options calmly. The exam often rewards answers that restore ongoing oversight rather than answers that treat launch as the finish line. Only after governance, program, and lifecycle are in view should you choose controls, because controls are the tools that operate inside the system those layers create. Controls are safeguards that reduce risk, detect problems, or correct harm, but they succeed only when governance gives them authority, program makes them repeatable, and lifecycle keeps them active over time. This is why the sequence matters so much. When you jump straight to controls, you can pick a technically sound safeguard that fails in practice because nobody owns it or because the workflow routes around it. A classic example is training, which can be valuable but often fails as a first move when the issue is immediate exposure and no enforceable boundary exists. Another example is a policy statement without safe alternatives, which creates shadow behavior because people still need to do work quickly. Control selection becomes sharper when you have already identified whether the environment can support the control. On exam questions, the best control is often the one that is enforceable and proportionate, and your mental model helps you see enforceability and proportionality. To use this mental model quickly, you need a simple way to diagnose which layer is most broken without overanalyzing. Start by asking what the scenario is really describing. Is it unclear decision authority? Is it inconsistent process execution? Is it risk emerging over time? Or is it a specific failure mode that needs a safeguard now? Unclear authority points to governance. Inconsistent execution points to program. Emerging over time points to lifecycle, and a specific failure mode points to controls. This diagnosis does not require fancy language. It requires you to notice the problem mechanism. For example, if a team is using AI in high-stakes decisioning without clear human accountability, the mechanism is not just model error, it is decision authority being delegated to an opaque process. If employees are pasting sensitive data into unapproved tools, the mechanism is not just ignorance. It is that the program has not provided safe workflows that match real needs. If a system is drifting, the mechanism is that lifecycle monitoring and change governance are weak. Once you name the mechanism, choosing the best answer becomes a matching exercise rather than guesswork. This mental model is also a defense against distractors because it forces you to check whether an option is operating at the right layer for the problem. Many distractors are wrong layer answers that promise improvement but do not touch the failure mechanism. If governance is unclear, an option that proposes advanced model evaluation is often a distractor because it does not solve who can approve, who can pause, or who is accountable. If program repeatability is missing, an option that proposes creating a single control for one team is often a distractor because it does not fix the system that will produce the same problem again next month. If lifecycle oversight is missing, an option that proposes one-time testing is often a distractor because risk will reappear as conditions change. The mental model keeps you from being seduced by answers that sound responsible but do not change the underlying system. It also helps you avoid overreaction options, because governance and program thinking naturally lead you toward proportionality rather than extreme bands that create hidden use. When you approach answers through layers, you are less likely to confuse activity with control. It helps to rehearse how the model works in a scenario where urgency is high, because urgency is where many learners freeze. Imagine a customer-facing generative assistant has produced a harmful output that is being shared publicly and leadership is worried about reputation. The first layer you check is governance, meaning who can authorize containment actions and who owns external communication decisions, because delays and contradictions can worsen harm. Next, you think program, meaning whether there is a playbook and whether roles are clear enough for parallel action without chaos. Then you think lifecycle, meaning whether monitoring and incident response were designed to detect and contain quickly, and whether change control will prevent recurrence. Only after that do you pick the first controls, such as constraining scope, requiring review, or pausing features, because now you know who can do it and how it will be executed. If you skip directly to a technical fix, you might lose the first critical hours while teams argue. The mental model guides you to stabilize authority and process first, because that is what makes containment possible under stress. Now consider a slower scenario where the harm is subtle, because the exam also tests whether you can manage risk that does not announce itself loudly. Imagine a decision support model is used in a workflow that affects access, and over months certain groups begin to complain that outcomes seem unfair. Governance thinking asks whether there is a defined risk appetite for fairness harms and whether leadership oversight exists for high-stakes decisioning. Program thinking asks whether there are repeatable evaluation and escalation routines, including how concerns are logged and reviewed rather than dismissed. Lifecycle thinking asks whether monitoring includes signals that can reveal uneven impact over time and whether changes in data or usage trigger reassessment. Only then do controls become the focus, such as refining boundaries on automation influence, improving validation across groups, or tightening human oversight. Notice how the first instinct is not to declare the model biased based on a few complaints, and it is also not to ignore complaints because the model performed well once. The mental model keeps you in disciplined decision-making. Define authority, ensure process, examine lifecycle evidence, then adjust controls. The sequence also helps when a question includes vendor reliance, because vendors create visibility gaps that can tempt you into wrong assumptions. If a scenario says a team adopted a vendor model quickly and is relying on the vendor's claims about safety, governance thinking reminds you that accountability still sits with the deploying organization. Program thinking then asks whether vendor due diligence is standardized, whether contracts define data handling and incident support, and whether evidence is collected consistently. Lifecycle thinking asks whether vendor model updates and service changes trigger reassessment, because drift can occur when the vendor changes behavior. Only then do controls come into view, such as restricting data categories, limiting integration scope, or setting monitoring thresholds and escalation pathways that include the vendor relationship. A distractor in these scenarios is to accept vendor assurance as a substitute for oversight, because that skips governance and program duties. Another distractor is to demand perfect transparency from the vendor as a first move when the urgent need is to constrain risky data exposure. The mental model helps you choose actions that are both realistic and protective. A key advantage of this model is that it keeps you from collapsing everything into a control debate, which is where exam time disappears. Learners often spend minutes comparing two technical-sounding controls while missing that the scenario is really about ownership, escalation, and decision boundaries. When you start with governance, you naturally ask who owns the risk decision and who has authority to act, and those clues often eliminate half the answer choices quickly. When you then move to program, you look for repeatability and enforceability, which eliminates options that are pure intention without mechanism. When you then move to lifecycle, you recognize whether the scenario is early-stage readiness or late-stage drift and response, which further narrows what kind of control is appropriate. By the time you reach control selection, you are no longer deciding between every option, you are deciding among the few that match the layer and timing. This also reduces anxiety because you are following a process rather than relying on intuition. Exams reward comm structure because comm structure produces consistent answers. Another way to make this mental model stick is to connect it to what the exam is really testing, which is judgment under constraints. The AAIR exam is not asking you to build the perfect organization in one step. It is asking you to choose the best next move given a scenario. Governance, program, lifecycle, then controls is an order that naturally fits next move thinking because it forces you to ensure the organization is capable of acting before you choose what action it should take. It also forces you to think in systems, which is the difference between compliance language and real risk management. When you recognize that a control will fail without ownership, you start choosing answers that establish accountability. When you recognize that a safeguard will be ignored if it does not fit workflow, you start choosing answers that provide safe alternatives and enforceable boundaries. When you recognize that testing once does not protect against drift, you start choosing answers that include monitoring and reassessment. This is the mental shift from memorizing to reasoning. As you practice, you will notice that many questions can be answered almost automatically once you locate the layer where failure is occurring. If the scenario screams unclear ownership or no authority to pause a risky launch, governance actions rise to the top. If the scenario shows every team doing its own thing and controls being applied inconsistently, program actions rise to the top. If the scenario shows problems emerging after deployment or after changes, lifecycle actions rise to the top. If the scenario is already stable at those layers, but a specific harm pathway remains open, then specific controls become the right focus. This is not a rigid rule that ignores nuance. It is a disciplined default that keeps you from getting pulled into distractions. Over time, The mental model becomes faster because you begin to recognize scenario patterns as soon as you hear them. That speed creates confidence, and confidence reduces the temptation to change answers late. As we close, the exam mental model of governance, program, lifecycle, then controls is a practical way to think like a risk leader rather than like a checklist follower. Governance tells you who decides, what is tolerated, and how accountability and escalation work when stakes are high. Program tells you whether those governance choices can be executed consistently through intake, tiering, evidence, and repeatable workflows. Lifecycle tells you whether the organization can remain safe over time through validation before exposure, monitoring during use, and reassessment during change. Controls then become the tools that operate inside that system, selected for enforceability, proportionality, and immediate impact on the risk driver. If you run this sequence on every question, you will spot distractors faster, choose stronger answers with less time wasted, and stay calm even when multiple options sound good. That is exactly what you want on exam day. A reliable thinking process that works even when you are tired and the scenario feels complicated.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.